Scott is a weed science researcher at Dalhousie University's agricultural campus, and his work focuses on understanding and managing weed pressures in wild blueberry systems, including challenging and emerging weed species. Through applied research and field trials, he supports growers with practical strategies to improve weed control and protect crop productivity. So I'll turn it over to Scott.
Hey, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. As kind of mentioned, this is going to be very informal, and so think of it more as I'm just leading a conversation about weeds that you have to deal with. Please shout out questions anytime, and kind of the... Oh, okay, add a microphone, please. But, you know, ask a question anytime if it comes to mind. And I'm really here just to kind of talk about what some of these weeds do in your blueberry fields, how I've seen them respond to some treatments, give some thoughts on management, but certainly based on how hard it's getting to find trial sites for different weeds, obviously many of you are being very successful with your weed control. So I'm not necessarily here to tell you what to do, but maybe more so just to lead a conversation about these weeds, and certainly welcome any input on what you're finding with your own strategies and things as well. Okay, and I just want to give a special thanks. Serge Sani helped me all summer in the field, and then Marcos and Tobias helped a lot in the lab this winter, finishing up some fescue seed bank stuff that I'm going to talk about here shortly. Okay. So just starting with sheep sorrel. So some of this stuff today is going to be well-tread ground, I think, to some extent. So bear with me, but hopefully I'll hit you with at least some new stuff as well. With some of these weeds, but sheep sorrel, always remember, always remember that you're dealing with a creeping perennial weed when you're dealing with this weed. Okay, so we see the green part above ground. You can call them shoots, you can call them ramets, you can call it shitweed for all I care. Doesn't really matter. Just remember that underground, they're all hugging or holding hands or connected by this underground creeping root system that spreads very, very aggressively in wild blueberry fields. So a lot of times a patch of sheep sorrel is like a patch of blueberries. It's just one plant with many, many shoots coming off of a common root system. Okay, and here, this is just an image I took many years ago, just using a paintbrush to brush away all the loose debris in a blueberry field, and you can see all the sheep sorrel roots running in around the blueberry stems and stuff there. So just remember that that's what you're dealing with. It's not individual plants, it's individual shoots of very, very large plants that you're trying to kill, which is one of the reasons why it's a difficult weed to manage. Now, sheep sorrel kind of has, I think, three advantages that give it a leg up as a weed in blueberries. The first is that unlike dogbane or goldenrod or many other perennial weeds, sheep sorrel gets flowering out of the way very early in the spring to leave the rest of the growing season for vegetative growth. And so when you go out into the field, even now, if you have no snow cover or within a couple of weeks, you're going to see sheep sorrel there if you have a sheep sorrel problem. This picture here was taken in late April in sprout field. Those plants that are already there, they're the ones that do most of the flowering and the seed production. So right out of the gate in the spring, the bar graph here is showing what proportion these different ramet populations contribute to the flowering population. And the way to interpret that is simply around 90% of the sheep sorrel shoots producing the red flowers we see every year are from shoot ramets that were produced in the previous season and that overwintered, and some new ones flower as well, but not very many of them. And so the reason why that's important is because obviously as a plant, investment in flowering is resource heavy. Sheep sorrel gets that out of the way right out of the gate in the spring so that it can focus the rest of the season on vegetative growth as a perennial plant, which is why it can so quickly begin to occupy things like blueberry fields. Okay, sheep sorrel also grows at very cold temperatures, and so in a wild blueberry field or just in our climate in general, sheep sorrel likely is actively growing anywhere all the way from April to December, potentially even into January for all I know in some years. So this is, look, the picture there is showing little sheep sorrel root fragments sprouting when stored at 1 degree Celsius. And I know this is kind of a weird graph, but that the y-axis is how many sprouts there are per root fragment when you store those root fragments at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 degrees Celsius. The point is they're still sprouting down at 1 degree Celsius, and the regression predicts that they won't stop sprouting until the temperature gets a little bit below zero. And so sheep sorrel has a very low base temperature for growth, and it can grow even in very cold temperatures. And so it takes advantage of the long falls, long growing seasons, etc. The second thing that I've noticed over the years and have some data for is that sheep sorrel just simply likes growing with blueberries. And so there's going to be 2 lines show up here, and it's going to be sheep sorrel density in the sprout field where the sheep sorrel is growing in blueberry patches and black circles and growing in bare soil patches in the open circles. They start out the same, but you can see throughout the sprout year, sheep sorrel produces far more shoots when it's growing with blueberries than when it's growing in the bare soil patches there. So there's just something about the environment created by the blueberry plants that sheep sorrel likes, and hence seems to grow better in the blueberry patches where you might intuitively think the blueberries might be more competitive in those areas and it might grow better in the bare soil patches, but it actually seems to be the opposite. Okay. And so just putting all that together, thank Travis for the mowed blueberry field picture. And so again, when you look at your field in the spring, any sheep sorrel plants you see there, remember first of all that they're one plant connected by an underground root system. And those plants that you see visible first thing in the spring, they're the ones that are going to bolt and flower and turn your field red. And then once that kicks in, all that sheep sorrel does, as the calendar keeps flipping by month after month, all it does is grow and grow and grow and never stops growing. And so you can beat it within an inch of its life and give it 4 or 5 months, and it's right back to where you started at square one, because it just goes and goes and goes all goddamn growing season. It never stops. And so that's one of the reasons why this plant is so hard to manage in a crop like blueberries, because once the blueberries are up in the sprout year, you really have no way to shut this down. And so if these plants survive a Spartan application or Ignite Chateau application in the fall, if there's still life there as your blueberries are coming up, then they're just going to go and go and go right up until Christmas time or New Year's. And so it's a weed that you can beat back, but as long as it is still alive by the time we get into the sprout year, then that plant has the whole sprout year well into Christmas time, and then it has the whole crop year to do the same thing over and over again. So it very quickly gets back on its feet after you knock it back with a herbicide treatment. And then the other problem with it is that it's constantly has new seedlings emerging as well. And so that's a little sheep sorrel seedling plant. And then this graph is just showing new sheep sorrel seedlings emerging throughout the summer. And in this graph, you can see that they emerge until you get into August or September. But in reality, new seedlings are coming up all the time. And so this is a picture that one of the students, Sergio, sent me in July a couple summers ago. He was tracking blueberry emergence. And we spent the whole summer looking for sheep sorrel seedlings. Not a single one would come up in the plots. And he sent me this picture in July with a middle finger and said, if you're looking for sheep sorrel seedlings, I found a whole bunch in the middle of a blueberry field, just at random. There was a whole shitload of them coming up there. And then even in September, you can see here's seedlings coming up. So they're coming up the whole season as well as the shoots coming from the established plants. And so if you add that on top of what we already looked at, then you've got seedlings coming up throughout the growing season. And when they emerge, they're very quickly producing their own creeping roots and becoming their own established perennial plants throughout the growing season. And those seedlings never stop growing because they don't flower in the year they come out of the ground. They need a cold treatment to be able to flower. And so they're coming up throughout the growing season. You can have sheep sorrel completely wiped out, not a single established plant left. But the seeds will keep trickling out of the seed bank right through till Christmas time. And again, by the time you get back around to the crop year, those plants coming from seed can completely reset the clock and become a new established perennial plants. And so you got to kill the plants that are already there, but you also have to stop these new plants coming back from seed. And hence, sheep sorrel just simply keeps up constant pressure in the environment that is a wild blueberry production system, because the established plants are constantly trying to regrow and plants are constantly trying to come back from seed all the time. And that's one of the reasons why it's so persistent in this particular cropping system. Okay, first thing I'll say, if you want to, I just got a couple of comments before we get into how this weed responds to some different herbicides. But I've seen it time and time again. If you want less sheep sorrel, my honest advice is don't kill poverty oak grass or any other benign grass. Okay, what I always say to any grower is if you have a grass and it's not fescue, don't panic. Don't even worry about it most of the time. Many of them are actually beneficial. And I've seen in many fields where growers will do an application of Sinbar or something because they're worried about the poverty oat. And in 3 years, the field's full of moss, it's full of sheep sorrel, it's full of hawkweed, and it's full of fescue. So pick your battles, the devil you know kind of thing. If poverty oak grass is your worst weed problem, then you're cruising in blueberry production. Just head to the LC already and call it a day, because you don't have, you can worry about something else at this point. Some of these grasses are very beneficial, especially when it comes to keeping weeds like sheep sorrel out. Aggressive removal of them will result in problems like sheep sorrel. Okay, I don't have any good data to support that, just observations that fields with a lot of poverty oak grass simply don't have sheep sorrel, and sheep sorrel often comes in once that grass is removed. Okay. Second is that the success you have with any given treatment program for sheep sorrel is going to be directly proportional to how well dug in your sheep sorrel population is. And so if you happen to have a blueberry field that has about this much sheep sorrel here, where it's just a little patch of it here and there, one shot of Spartan, one shot of Ignite Chateau, even Steadfast might control that for you and have that completely wiped out with one application. But if you've got a stubborn sheep sorrel problem, that field's been red with sheep sorrel for several years, there's a strong seed bank there, then it's going to take many more herbicide applications and repeated pressure on that sheep sorrel to get rid of it. And I see this a lot in field trials where I'll have the same trial at different sites, and some at the sites where the sheep sorrel is more well established because you're getting thousands of seedlings per square meter. The treatments always are weaker at those fields compared to ones where you have very little seedling emergence, and the sheep sorrel just hasn't had as many years to grow there. Treatments are always more successful there. And so if you don't want sheep sorrel, try to get it, when it's back here, if possible. Just understand that if it's well dug in, especially if it's got a strong seed bank, then it's going to take multiple years to wear that down, because of the fact that those seedlings are going to constantly be trying to emerge and reestablish until all the seeds are gone. Okay. So kind of my hope here, as daunting as this looks, is to kind of walk through this table. So when I saw that I was 245 to 430, as usual, I put together probably too many things. But these are all the products that I've tried on sheep sorrel over the years. Some of them help, some of them don't. I've got some comments up there on many of them. And I just kind of want to just walk through in a timely manner, hopefully, some thoughts on each of these products and what you can expect with them in terms of performance, and which ones you might be able to string together to try to get a treatment program. And so over the years, I've done a lot of work with Lontrel and Velpar on sheep sorrel. And from what I've seen, neither one of those are very helpful for sheep sorrel. In the work I've done, I know a lot of folks use Lontrel on hawkweed, and it's very helpful on that. And it does have some activity on sheep sorrel, but generally speaking, it's very short-lived. And so even though it's a broadleaf weed killer, it doesn't seem to be very effective on sheep sorrel. It does look like the Velpar resistance in sheep sorrel is quite well established. Velpar has failed for me on sheep sorrel in every trial I've ever done with it. And then I've got question marks for Sinbar, and I'm open to suggestions here. I haven't done a ton of work with Sinbar on sheep sorrel, mainly because it's a very expensive treatment. It gets rid of beneficial grasses, which help sheep sorrel. But I don't have a ton of good data on just how lethal sheep sorrel or Sinbar might be to sheep sorrel. I know some folks have very good luck with the Velpar Sinbar mix on it, so Sinbar may be helping a little bit. And some of the best sheep sorrel control I've ever seen is in fields that have a Velpar Sinbar Spartan mix. It does very well. So it may bring something to the table for sheep sorrel. We generally think of Sinbar as a sod killer, but Sinbar kills a lot of herbicide, a lot of weeds, dicot and grass weeds. So it may or may not help. I don't have good data on that. With Ignite, Roundup, and Ingenia, so Ingenia would be Banvel, what we would traditionally refer to as Banvel. I did a lot of work with those early days when I first started at Dow. They do help with sheep sorrel, but they don't seem to hold on it. So Ignite by itself is not a good perennial weed killer anyway, because it doesn't translocate. It does very good burn off, but doesn't tend to translocate. So anyway, this graph is way back in 2015, 2016. You can see the starting sheep sorrel population in the fall, and then the lines show the change in population into the following spring in the control, and then in Banvel, Roundup, Ignite, and then Spartan. This is where we first started getting onto the Spartan for sheep sorrel. And you can see that with the Roundup, the Banvel, and the Ignite by itself anyway, the sheep sorrel tended to recover from all those treatments, similar to the control, whereas the Spartan held a little bit better. So those products, if I was going to use Ignite on sheep sorrel, it would definitely be in a mix with Chateau, because the Chateau gives very good residual control of sheep sorrel seedlings, which we'll get to here shortly. I know a lot of folks are playing around with Roundup. I'm not going to openly stand up in front of an audience and say to boom spray your field with Roundup, even though I have recommended it to growers for red fescue and some other things there. Over the years, I never found that it held on sheep sorrel, probably because Roundup has no soil activity, and hence the sheep sorrel can just come back from seed, even if it is lethal to the established plants. But I know a lot of growers are playing around with different uses of Roundup right now. And if you are using it in fields that have sheep sorrel, you are almost certainly getting some benefit in terms of sheep sorrel control from that treatment. And then the Ingenia or Banvel. Sheep sorrel is very sensitive to dicamba, the active in Ingenia, but that's a hard product to recommend for a broadcast spray because it's very touch and go in terms of crop tolerance. And so even a fall spray can carry over and damage the blueberry plants. And so that's a hard one to recommend as a boom spray. But it is, if it does, sheep sorrel is quite sensitive to that active, especially the high rates, just as an FYI. Now, curb is highly variable on sheep sorrel in my experience. And the best use of curb is just a Hail Mary shot in the fall of the sprout year to try to suppress sheep sorrel a little bit in the following crop year. So these are sort of the results you can generally expect from a fall curb application on sheep sorrel. And so generally curb will reduce the overall sheep sorrel density, maybe by about 40, 50% if you're lucky on a good year. The biggest thing that curb does, though, is notice here in the far right graph, is that it slows the sheep sorrel down and stops a lot of the overwintering plants from flowering. And so curb is very deceptive in that if you have a bad sheep sorrel problem, you spray your field with curb in the fall, it's going to look beautiful in the crop year. But trust me when I say there's a lot of sheep sorrel underneath the blueberries waiting to explode at a moment's notice. And so it's an expensive investment in terms of suppression rather than reliable control. But that said, there really isn't anything else going into the crop year that can be used with guaranteed crop safety other than curb. So it is, as a last resort, if your sprout year has gone awry and you have a lot of sheep sorrel going into the crop year, it will probably help with pollination and harvest and stuff like that. But you're still going to have a significant sheep sorrel problem to deal with once that field gets mowed. Okay, now Steadfast, so this would be Altum, what we used to call Altum, and is very, very similar. Steadfast is similar, but not quite the same, but it's close enough. The main use for that with sheep sorrel would be as a spring tank mix with anything you're putting out in the spring, just as a general suppressive tool for sheep sorrel. It kills seedlings, but it doesn't kill the established plants. And so here's some data on Altum compared to a control. And so if you just look at the black line here, the black circles, that's the density in a control plot over the summer. And then the white circles are with Altum here, but you would get the same results with Steadfast. And so the way I explain Steadfast on sheep sorrel is think of it just like a pause button. So the sheep sorrel, when you spray it, the density's not going to go up. The density's not going to go down either. It's going to just hold where it's at. And eventually the efficacy will fizzle out and you can see the sheep sorrel recovering by the end of the summer. Okay. Again, Altum or Steadfast are a little deceptive because one of the things they do is they stop sheep sorrel from flowering. And so if you're just doing some windshield scouting or something, again, the field will look clean driving by. But again, there's a lot of sheep sorrel still hiding underneath the blueberry plants. But it does help with seedling control. I know this is a lot of info, but it does help with seedling control. And so just as a general maintenance sort of treatment, if you have a little bit of sheep sorrel or you just want to be putting something out with your spring Velpar or something that might help with sheep sorrel and you want to have something relatively cheap and get some grass control, which Steadfast will also give, then it's a very solid tank mix partner with Velpar or Velpar and Synbar in the spring because it will help a little bit with sheep sorrel. But if the field's already full of sheep sorrel, it's not going to be the ticket that you're looking for. Where am I at here? Callisto. I still don't know on Callisto, but if I had a sheep sorrel problem, my thought would be that I would be wanting to include Callisto as a summer broadleaf herbicide application if it's layered with something else applied in the previous fall or that spring. Okay, I don't have the data I have to support that statement is sketchy. It's more a gut feeling than anything. But here, I've done this trial at a couple of sites now, and so it's a control, Callisto pre-emergence on May 2nd in this case, post-emergence on May 21st, sequential half rate Callisto, so half rate on May 21, and then again on May 30th or whatever the hell that date is there. Spartan on May 2nd, Spartan plus Callisto on May 2nd, Spartan on May 2, followed by Callisto May 21, and then Spartan followed by the sequential half rate Callisto. Get to the end of the summer. The reason why I think Callisto has some value with sheep sorrel is that even though it's not statistically separating, it does cause a little dip in the population. And I've consistently seen the sequential half rate of Callisto reduce sheep sorrel density relative to the control. And so even though if you had Spartan out, the Callisto doesn't add value, I do think Callisto is a useful seedling killer for sheep sorrel. And so the fact that it's the only broadleaf herbicide you can put out after the blueberries are up, I think it's a wise investment given that it's relatively inexpensive to at least supplement a sheep sorrel base spray such as Spartan or Velpar and Steadfast with some Callisto a bit later in the summer. I'm quite confident that it's better than not doing it. I just don't know exactly how much better it is just yet. But I had this at another site over the last couple of years, and again, the exact same results, the sequential half rate, reducing density relative to the control. Didn't help if you already had Spartan out there, but do note that for the first time in a long time, I actually had treatments in which the sheep sorrel was completely eliminated, and the only treatments that eliminated it was when you had Spartan followed by Callisto there. So I do think that if you have a bad sheep sorrel problem, keeping Callisto in the equation, especially both sprout and crop year if you can, is likely helping with that weed. Now, Alliion's been a tough nut to crack in terms of finding a strong response in different weed species with it. I've tried it in both fall and spring trials, and what I can say based on the results that I've seen, if I was going to include Allion in a sheep sorrel management program, it would definitely be as a spring residual treatment for seedling control. And so this is looking at a fall and spring Allion applications on established sheep sorrel plants as well as on seedlings. And note that the fall application of Allion causes a little reduction in the established sheep sorrel population in the following season. The spring treatment doesn't. And so the takeaway from that is obviously Allion is having some effect on sheep sorrel in the fall that's reducing its winter survivability. But trust me when I say the sheep sorrel gets fired out of a cannon later in the summer, and that control fizzles out fairly quickly. And note with the seedling response, the fall, even though Allion is considered quite persistent in soils, the fall application didn't help with spring seedling control when just considering the control treatment and the Allion, but the spring treatment definitely seems to reduce seedling density. And so if you're considering that herbicide as part of your weed control program, it does bring a different group number to the equation for residual sheep sorrel seedling control if it happens to be in the budget to give that product a try. Okay, now Authority and Chateau, those are the gold standard for sheep sorrel seedling control in your cropping system as far as I'm concerned. Both of them are highly variable in terms of effects on established sheep sorrel plants. But they're both very, very good seedling killers. Authority works best as a spring residual treatment for seedling control, and Chateau works great as both either a fall or a spring residual treatment for sheep sorrel seedlings. And so I'm only showing seedling data here because neither Authority or Chateau, in my experience, give very good control of the established plants. But note, with the seedling density, with Authority in the fall, you don't get any carryover effect on the spring seedling density, but Authority applied in the spring gives good control of sheep sorrel seedlings. And note, with the Chateau, either a fall or a spring application, both of those tend to give very good control of sheep sorrel. So obviously the fall treatment was applied after mowing in the fall, and then the seedling density is taken the next year, and then the spring treatments, Authority and Chateau, are applied in the spring of the sprout year. And so again, the product that I would recommend right now for residual seedling control, it pretty much has to be Chateau. It seems to be very, very consistent performer when it comes to giving pretty decent residual seedling control for sheep sorrel. And last year, I had a grower had done, what did he do? No, I'm going to cancel that story because I can't remember. Anyways, it's a very good residual product. I don't know exactly how long the residual lasts, but it is very, very good. And so if you've got a stubborn sheep sorrel population where you know you've got a strong seed bank, and you can tell if you've got a strong sheep sorrel seed bank or not, just go out and take some soil samples in a W pattern, put them in a pot and water them. If that comes up green with sheep sorrel, then you know your soil's full of sheep sorrel seeds and that you've got a lot of seedlings that you got to deal with over the long haul. And so the best product to have in your soil, taking out those germinating seeds and young seedlings, that I've found is definitely Chateau. Okay, now Casseron, I'm not going to show any data on that because I know it's prohibitively expensive for a lot of folks, but it is a solid sheep sorrel killer if you're willing to invest in it. It kills established plants, it kills seedlings, it kills a lot of weeds in blueberry fields. So if there's anybody here from from the companies, if you can get a hold, if you can make diclofenac for less than $1,500 an acre, then you have a solid herbicide on your hands. But until then, it's pretty tough to recommend. But I know some growers are sprinkling some around, and it is very, very good herbicide. It's just unfortunately economically a little unviable right now. Now with Chikara and Spartan, they're both interchangeable on sheep sorrel, so they're both good for fall control of established plants, and spring applications will give good control of established plants, but also give you seedling control as well. And you can swap them out. Spartan, I do most of my work with Spartan because it's the cheaper product. And if you have two products that perform the same, it's hard not to recommend you go with the cheaper one. Now this is just some fall data. So control, Spartan and Chikara applied in the fall, and then you can see how they knock the sheep sorrel back by the following spring compared with the control. But then you can see the sheep sorrel starts clawing its way back like clockwork throughout the growing season and into the following crop year. And that's showing the fact that the fall application of Spartan and Chikara don't control seedlings in the following spring. And so I remember these trials clearly because I remember looking at the ground in late April and the plots were clean. And then I remember looking at the plots in late May, and they were just a solid carpet of sheep sorrel seedlings after the Spartan had taken out the established plants. And then by the end of the season, end of the cycle, you're right back where a control would be, because of those seedlings coming back. But the spring treatment, neither of them are perfect in the spring either, but they do knock the sheep sorrel back better than, obviously, than doing nothing, I would hope to think anyway. But they also provide pretty good seedling control when applied in the spring. And so that's the big difference between a fall and a spring Spartan application. Is obviously the fall is easier and you have less risk of crop injury, but you're sacrificing a lot of seedling control by putting it out in the fall relative to the spring. Okay. Now, what I've been doing is, now that we've kind of got on to a good residual seedling killer, is looking at some trials that are combining Chateau with Spartan, both fall and spring, to see how these might work together. And so this is some work from last year, and this line is showing spray November. This is a fall trial. So you can see the density in November in the control, and then how it went over the summer last year. Note that big dip. I don't know if anybody else noticed this last year, but the drought last summer fried the sheep sorrel. And so it was brown, even in the control plots come August in a lot of cases. So there was a bit of a dip there, but obviously once it started raining again, she really picked up right where it left off. This is the fall Chateau application, so low and high rate, so 228 and 224, 448 mils per hectare of the new liquid formulation there. And so I know they look far apart, but always remember, when you're talking about sheep sorrel, you have error bars from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. And so it's hard to get statistical separations, but certainly the high rate of Chateau in the fall certainly did have some effect on the sheep sorrel there. This is the Spartan application here. I think I'm having a hard time seeing the graph. Yes. Okay. I should know just by the results anyway. But okay, this is the fall application of the Spartan. So note that it knocked it back, but then note that the sheep sorrel is reestablishing throughout the year because you don't have any seedling control. And then that's with the Chateau tank mixed with it in the fall. And so again, the Chateau in with the Spartan in the fall did tend to keep the density a bit lower going through the summer than just the Spartan alone, which would indicate that having the Chateau in the mix, if you're putting Spartan out in the fall, adding Chateau to that would seem to be beneficial. And then this is the seedling density at this site. And so that's how you know it's a well dug in sheep sorrel population, when you're pushing 1,000 seedlings per square meter. And so you can see the control and the Spartan alone are similar, because the Spartan doesn't give any carryover residual activity from a fall application. But just note that the fall applications of Chateau, either alone or with Spartan, did get a lot of the seedlings coming up in the following spring. Hey, now this was a spring trial, the exact same treatments, and so you can see the control going through the summer there. There's the spring Chateau treatments. I actually found they were a little better on the established sheep sorrel plants than the fall treatment seemed to be, although just take that with a grain of salt for the moment. And then that's the Spartan, which again always performs better as a spring application on sheep sorrel. And then that's the Spartan with the Chateau. In the spring application, the overall sheep sorrel density was statistically similar, whether you had Chateau in with the Spartan or not. But when we look at the seedling data, the Chateau did give a little bit of an additional reduction in seedlings relative to the Spartan alone. And so again, Chateau is a very, very good sheep sorrel seedling killer. If you are fighting a lot of sheep sorrel, a very persistent sheep sorrel problem, Chateau is definitely something that should be in your chemical shed for the coming growing season, because it does seem to be very, very helpful at helping with that seedling component of the population, which to date has been very challenging to find a reliable product to do that. And so to me, a core sheep sorrel program is going to build around those 4 bold products there. But all of these other products in bold still bring something to the table, and they should be used to kind of round out a base program built around the group 2s and the group 14s there with some of these other products. And again, if you're playing around with fall or spring applications of things like Roundup, if you're trying Banville or something and you're getting good results, I'd love to hear about what you're kind of seeing with some of those. And if you found a way to reliably make curb kill sheep sorrel, I'd be happy to hear about that as well. Does anyone have any questions on sheep sorrel?
One came in from online.
Yeah.
Would fire control seedlings or seeds?
It generally makes the seeds germinate. And so post burn, generally you get a lot of sheep sorrel coming up from seed. So you could basically use fire like a stale seed bed, in that you could use fire to stimulate germination as long as you have a herbicide you can apply to kill those seedlings after the burn. Yeah, it would actually, stringing that together would actually be very good. It's just not practical for a lot of folks. Yeah.
I had another one come in online. What is a safe cutoff date for applying Chateau for sheep sorrel seedling control this spring?
I applied it on now calendar date. I want to be careful here because that's year to year. That's highly variable. But I applied it on May 2nd last year, and the blueberries responded well. I generally, my word of advice would be spring Chateau. Try to get that out sometime in April, if permissible. Yeah. I don't know if has anybody else played around with Chateau in the spring? Any experience? Yeah. Because I know Vanessa DeVoe in New Brunswick, she put some out on May 15th last year, and boy, those plots were black. So do make sure that if you see blueberry growth, she's over. Don't put Chateau down in the spring. Make sure the plants are dormant because it is very hot on them. Hey, now with fescue, I'm just going to talk about the hair fescue one here today. That's a simple herbaceous perennial is what fescue is. And so an individual clump of fescue is essentially analogous to a dandelion plant in that the clump, like a dandelion plant, has no lifespan. They live forever and just get progressively larger and larger until something kills them. And as they get larger and larger, all they become is an increasingly efficient seed production machine and produce more and more seeds the bigger they get. But what makes them a simple herbaceous perennial is they don't produce creeping structures like rhizomes, creeping roots, etc. So the only way they can reproduce and the only way they can get around is by seed. Okay. Now, the hair fescue, like a lot of simple perennials, it does have to go through winter to be able to flower. And so these are some old data that I did when I first started up at the college there. And so this is storing fescue plants in a walk-in cooler at 4 degrees for 0, 5, 10, 15 weeks. And note that when plants come from seed, they need at least some cold exposure in order to be able to flower. And so the takeaway from that is fescue, any fescue coming from seed in a given year isn't going to produce flowers and make more seeds. It's going to have to go through winter before it can do that. And all established plants also have to go through winter in order to be able to flower. Okay. Now, the biggest problem with fescue is that it's essentially a commercial grass, and hence its seeds behave like a commercial grass seed in that they have very high germinability. And so this is germination rate of fresh fescue seeds collected from plants at these locations. And so those seeds were stored in light or dark in wet petri dishes within a week of harvest from the plants. And you can see that they have a very high germination rate. And so the seeds produced by fescue, and I'm pretty sure if you look at the history, this is not a native species. This is introduced specifically as a lawn grass, a ground cover, and it is very good, obviously, at doing that. And so the seeds, like a lot of these types of grasses, they don't have complex dormancy mechanisms because the people that breed them want them to germinate when you plant them, and want them to be able to grow. And so, but that does affect the seed bank, and that's going to be the whole point of what I'm going to talk about here, because this is bad because you get a lot of seedlings coming up in the fall and to some extent the spring. And when seeds are moved on machinery, they germinate that same year and you spread this stuff like wildfire. But it also means that the seeds probably don't live a long time in the soil and you can wear down the seed bank with a bit of persistent management. Okay. Now, this is when fescue seedlings emerge in blueberry fields. So what I found over the years is in the sprout year, you get a peak in seedling emergence in the spring, and then that gradually declines going into summer. And then in late summer, after the plants flower and set seed, you get another peak in seedling emergence from the soil. And then going into the crop year, just note there's a dramatic scale change between the two graphs. You also, again, get seedlings emerging in the spring and then not too much in the summertime. And then you get a large amount of seedlings emerging again in the fall after the plants that are there have produced new seeds. Okay. And so what happens, what this means in a blueberry field is when you start out in the sprout year, you have a bunch of vegetative fescue. If you look at the ground, there will be a whole bunch of grass seed on the ground around those. That seed will be seed that was produced last year and didn't germinate but carried over to the following sprout year. Those are the seeds that give you your sprout year seedlings, and then the seed bank, as far as I'm concerned, dries up as you go into summer, and then the plants that are there bolt, flower, produce new seeds. Those seeds hit the ground, and in a very short period of time, many of them germinate and become new seedlings, but some of them do carry over to the crop year. And then in the following crop year, any ungerminated seeds that are alive from the sprout year will germinate and give you new seedlings in the spring of the crop year. And then the seed bank dries up until you get it replenished in the fall by the fescue again. And then the seeds produced will give you a peak or a spike in seedling emergence the fall of the crop year. And what's left will carry over to the spring of the sprout year, and give you the rest of those seedlings. And so when you kind of line that up with these graphs, that's where these peaks come from. So any seedlings emerging in the sprout year are seeds produced in the crop year, and then those seeds run out and the seed bank dries up. And then when you go into the fall of the sprout year, new seedlings are coming from new seeds produced by the plants that are there. And then any seeds that don't germinate here go forward to the crop year, and the whole thing starts over again. And so every summer of every year of your blueberry production cycle, there's a temporary reduction in the fescue seed bank in the summer when the leftover seeds from the crop year get used up and the plant is getting ready to send more seeds back to the seed bank to make more seedlings. And so this gives us a chance to shut that down, because once you start stopping fescue from going to seed over multiple years, My hunch is that that seed bank starts to dissipate very quickly because the seeds don't live for a long time in the seed bank. They either germinate or they die within a very short period of time. Now, one of the first experiments that I did with the help of the Island Association at the time was test to see if we could reduce the fescue seed bank. And don't worry too much about the treatments in this picture. But if you just look at the red treatments, note that when I did this trial, the only thing you could do for crop year fescue control was curb at that time. And so just note that in any treatments where there was a sprout year fescue treatment combined with a crop year curb treatment, that the seed bank was reduced at the end of the crop year relative to the non-treated control, as well as compared to other treatments in which the fescue was allowed to recover and go to seed in the crop year. So that provided at least some initial evidence that if you consecutively stop fescue from going to seed, that you can potentially eliminate or at least wear down that seed bank. And so I think Hugh already mentioned this. But I know when I put this together, I didn't know that Hugh had it covered. And I was still getting people asking, where the hell is clethodim? Is it registered? Is it not registered? And I found these 3 labels on the PMRA website, all that have low bush blueberry on them. And I think Hugh has already mentioned that the consideration is it's officially registered. Finally, maybe. I don't know. Unless I misunderstand the Canadian registration system, when your crop is on a label for a pesticide, you can use that pesticide in your crop. Now, they will all have different absolute application rates in terms of product based on the active ingredient concentration. But just FYI, it's 91 grams of active ingredient per hectare that you want to use with any clethodim product. Don't go above that. And they all use unique adjuvants. And so you won't, if you haven't used clethodim before, you won't have Amigo or Journey or potentially Exact in your shed. So make sure clethodim requires unique adjuvant chemistry to be effective. So make sure you do get the right adjuvants with them if you do use them. Okay. Now, I showed these data in the fall. All I want to talk about primarily with fescue here today is that we can drive that seed bank right back to hell within a single production cycle, and that with careful management and machine cleaning, you can probably eradicate fescue and keep it out of your fields. And so with the data that I'm going to show here, focus less on the treatments per se and more on the concept that you can eliminate the fescue seed bank. That's the goal of the slide. I don't give a shit if you do it with Chiquera Ignite, if you use Ignite Chateau. I really don't care, as long as the treatments stop seed production in both the sprout and the crop year. What I want you to take away from these data is that you can actually reduce and potentially get rid of the fescue seed bank in your field, and hence stop this weed from coming back on your ground. And so if we just look at the first set of treatments here, we did nothing in the sprout year, and then that was also followed by nothing in the crop year, or Arrow as a clethodim product in this trial in the crop year, or a fall sprout year curb application. And so just note that if you do nothing both years in a row, it's around 25,000 fescue seeds per square meter sitting on the ground. Are we confident in that number, Tobias, based on your experience? We counted all of them, so I'm more confident in these numbers than the date of my son's birthday, to be honest. So that's how many are there. But note that one shutdown of seed production in the crop year, either with Arrow or curb, and you drop that seed bank by 75, 79%, all the way up to almost 90%. With one herbicide application and stopping it from going to seed in 1 year. And what these data show is what I had just mentioned in that note, that in all of these treatments, fescue went to seed in the sprout year, but likely very few of those seeds are still there at the end of the crop year. And when you stop the grass from going to seed in the crop year, those fresh seeds are not added to the seed bank, and hence that seed bank is reduced very quickly, even with just one herbicide application. And obviously Curb would be a little better than clethodim because it's better on fescue than clethodim is. But still, even with $10 per acre, you can get quite a substantial reduction in the seed bank just with one herbicide application. Now, obviously, the Cadillac treatments would start with Curb. And if you start out the cycle with one Curb application and nothing else, again, you get quite a significant reduction in the seed bank. It's not 100%, but you do get quite a reduction. Layering that with Arrow or clethodim does help a little bit in terms of bring that down a bit further. And then if you wanted to, what I would say, I know nobody in this room wants to do 2 Curb applications, but if it gives you any solace at all, you've reduced the seed bank, I would estimate, by 94% if you do invest in those treatments, which means that that seed bank is basically gone at the end of that cycle. And so you would basically have fescue borderline eradicated. And as long as you didn't bring any more seed into your land on machinery, you would theoretically have that fescue beat at that point with just a simple Chair Ignite, Chateau Ignite, or something like that to finish off any straggling plants that might come up from that remaining little bit of seed bank. Okay. Now, Synbar, it didn't reduce the seed bank really in this trial. Synbar always seems to give very good suppression of fescue in the sprout year, but by itself, I've seen the fescue usually recovers and goes to seed again in the crop year. And so obviously you're going to have a larger seed bank there, but follow it with Arrow or Curb if you want it to do that. And you get the seed bank down just as much as you did with Curb, but without having to use that group number. And then similar with the Chacara Ignite treatments, note that one of each of those by themselves helps with the seed bank. But again, they're obviously better if they're layered with a crop year control with either Arrow or Curb. Okay. Again, less emphasis on the treatments here, more emphasis on the fact that if you can stop fescue from going to seed in both the sprout and the crop year, that you have that seed bank almost completely eliminated in one production cycle. And therefore, in the following cycle, with careful management, you should be able to theoretically at least eradicate hair fescue from your land. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah.
I notice you don't have Arrow all in first.
I do. This question was coming.
Why didn't you use the Arrow all in first and then Curb on the crop?
So there's nothing stopping you guys from doing that. So this is what I did for this experiment. If I was insane, I could have added 19 more treatments to it. Yeah, anyway. But the reason I didn't is because the most valuable use of the clethodim is as a crop year treatment, because it's your one time a year where you have no other choice but to use Curb. So in the sprout year, you can use different group numbers to get the fescue on the run. Your best use of group 1 is to use it as a crop year treatment as a substitute for Curb, okay, in my opinion. But that being said, there's nothing stopping you as a grower from spraying Arrow or any other clethodim product in the sprout year, again in the crop year, and driving that rate to as far as you can go until you get resistance. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But what I'm trying to show by example here is I believe it to be better reserved for the crop year and use the group numbers you can't use in the crop year during the sprout year is what I recommend. Yeah. And it could be as simple and as cheap as a Steadfast application in the sprout year and an Arrow application in the crop year. would reduce the seed bank because Steadfast will suppress the fescue as well. These are what I used because I was also interested in other effects, including tuft reductions and stuff. But as a grower, if you have a bit of fescue, if you did Steadfast in with a spring treatment and then Arrow in the crop year, your fescue is going to be quite well suppressed. Seed bank's going to be reduced for a relatively inexpensive price. You will still have those living plants that you will eventually have to finish off with something at some point. But so that's why, long answer short, that's why it's not in the sprout year. Okay, so again, the seed banks, they are short-lived, they are transient. If you're careful and diligent, they can be reduced. Clethodim is a good alternative to curb for crop year fescue suppression and seed bank management. Also remember that when you have no seeds being formed in the crop year, there are no seeds being spread on machinery either. And hence, that should help contain that weed a little bit better. And again, stopping fescue seed production in both the sprout and the crop year is the key. It's irrelevant to me how you achieve that in terms of what treatments you use. As long as you stop seed production in both years, you can start wearing down the seed production. And so just as a nut bar idea, I try to throw one into every presentation. I did a mowing trial quite a few years ago now. You can tell how far back it is by the skinnier I am compared to now in the picture. So this was a little while ago. But I just, with a push mower, mowed fescue in the fall. And then on April 30th, June 1st, and June 15th, and Hugh helped me with this trial, actually helped me drag this mower out there. But if you note, obviously mowing's not going to kill fescue, but note that when you mowed on June 1st or June 15th, that there was no flowering and hence no seed production. Now, I know most folks aren't going to wait that late to mow a blueberry field, but there's a sweet spot between April 30th and June 1st where you can mow fescue and it will not produce seed heads. And so here's an image where this plot was mowed June 1st. This one was mowed April 30th, and the picture was taken in July. And you can see that the fescue is just idling there, but is not producing seed. Okay, so like cleaning machinery, potentially something as, I'll just air quote, simple as potentially rethinking a spring mowing timing. Those are things that you guys can do for yourself and that can never be taken away from you, right? It's something you can do. It'll never be deregistered, for example, to mow in June or something like that. So you will always have access to that. So it's just something to think about, or even if you're resting ground, to stop fescue and other grasses from going to seed. A well-timed mowing can do that. But potentially with, the longer growing seasons, this would take more work to become something where you could recommend without any compromise on the blueberry yield. But the blueberries did respond fairly well to that mowing timing in that trial. Now, just a couple other things about fescue. Always try to keep in mind that it is a highly variable weed in terms of its size. And so even within a square meter, you will have plants that are 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times bigger than other plants. And that's a significant source of variability in fescue response to herbicides, particularly any non-curb herbicide treatment. So I know this is a cluttered graph, but these are box plots of fescue size as biomass across a bunch of blueberry fields. The plus sign is the average for each site. The top line is the biggest, the maximum. The bottom line is the minimum, and most of the values lie within the rectangle. And obviously the ones on the bottom, the lower Y scale, are small. The ones at the top are very, very large. And so all I want you to take away from this figure is note that the average size of fescue is highly variable, both across sites as well as within sites. And in any given field, you can have your largest plant I think I did the, if I remember right, can be up to 10,000 times larger than the smallest plant, right? And so those bigger plants are always going to be the ones that are going to survive. Something like Chiquera, something like Steadfast, something like Ignite Chateau, or something like that. Those smaller ones are always going to be more sensitive to a herbicide. And so that's just an ongoing conundrum with a weed like fescue, this high variability in plant size at the time of any given herbicide application just doesn't help the situation in terms of getting 100% control, because Weed Science 101 is generally weed control efficacy declines with increasing plant size. And so if you've got a field where the clumps of grass are very big, you're going to have a harder time and have less success than your neighbor who may have tufts on the smaller side. And so here, just looking at these images, those are some fescue clumps that I would say are on the smaller side. And in some years, with even just a fall application of Ignite, I have found that to be very effective on very small clumps of fescue. But as they get big, they have too many growing points, and they can survive even some of the most aggressive herbicides. And so this site was particularly bad one year, in which you can see the fescue plants here are obviously huge, and even Curb didn't take it all out at that site. And so you can see this is the fall of the sprout year after Curb was applied the previous year, and you can see a lot of those bigger plants are still coming back there. So just keep that in mind, that a lot like sheep sorrel in terms of how well dug in it is, all this stuff affects herbicide performance in terms of if you're unlucky and every one of your fescue tufts is bigger than your head, well, you have a disadvantage compared to your friend whose fescue tufts are no bigger than your fist. They obviously have an advantage over you in terms of the success rate with any non-Curb herbicide. And it's just something that we can't control, but it's just something that just adds more inherent challenges to dealing with a weed like that. Okay. Now, on this line of variable response or variability, I had enough sites built up now with the Chiquera Ignite treatment where we can pick out some trends now, and I just wanted to kind of share these results. And so this is spring sprout year applications of Chiquera Ignite on fescue, and it was 16 sites. And I found that gave what I would expect from that treatment to be good fescue control, so greater than 70%, at about 56% of the sites. The rest of the sites, it tended to come up a bit short, and those are the sites highlighted in red. I don't have all the reasons for why we get this variable response, but just note in the spring trials, note that obviously something happened in 2022 because the majority of the poor performance with that treatment on fescue was in the spring of 2022. And I mentioned this in the past, but when I look at the weather station data for 2022, it was very, very hot. Thinking back to Harrison's presentation as well, that was a very hot year. It was a very dry year, and the relative humidity was very, very low that spring. And in order for this tank mix to pack its biggest punch, the conditions need to be right for both the Chiquera and the Ignite component to perform at their optimum. And Ignite is weak under low humidity, drought stress, low light conditions, etc. And so that spring just seemed to be a bad spring for that treatment. Some of the other years, it was a bit better, obviously, than those. But just want to kind of just acknowledge here, finally, with enough site years, that I am picking up that it can be damn good, but there can be times where it does come up short. And I think some growers have mentioned that, and I see that in my trials as well. And I'm kind of teasing out the factors that might be affecting that. And Marcos, the grad student, is working on that as well. Had it out 25 times in the fall of the crop year, and it's definitely been better in the fall than in the spring. So greater than 70% control at 64% of the sites. all the way up to 95% control, which is obviously quite good. But there have been some sites where it came up short. I highlight two of them here. North River and Collingwood in 2020. I remember those sites specifically. I sprayed both of those sites while there was still dew on the fescue plants, and obviously that was a very bad idea. And so you would get the same effect if it was Ignite Chateau, for example, as well. So those sites where the grass was wet when I sprayed it, it ran off the plants and obviously got very poor control. There are some other sites where it has also come up a bit short, and I don't know the exact reasons, but again, I'm using the weather station data to try to piece that together. But if you are trying that treatment and you find that it's very good sometimes and a little weak sometimes, I'm finding the same thing. And part of my time now is trying to tease out some of the factors that might be affecting that. Okay. And then lastly for fescue, I just want to throw in this picture just because I find it interesting. This is fescue that happened to be in a Velpar plot in a sheep sorrel trial. And I just thought it was very interesting where you can see the Velpar still killing some of the young fescue and killing some of the seedlings, but obviously some of them are very, very happy from the Velpar, and they're very green. And that's resistance selection in action right there, because those are going to die. These ones obviously are resistant to Velpar, and they're going to survive and potentially produce seeds. So if you see peculiar responses like that, where you have surprisingly healthy plants amongst otherwise sick and damaged plants, try to take pictures, send them to me. That's usually a concerning sight, especially when they're in close proximity to each other. But that said, a number of you have told me over the years that you still get the occasional surprise from Velpar on fescue, and that would be why, because there's still sensitive biotypes out there, and hence every now and then you might get a little free shot at fescue from Velpar. Right? Do you want me to keep rolling, or do we want to pull the plug? Okay, yeah, perfect. Hey, so cow wheat, I'll just show some stuff that grad student Vanessa DeVoe did for her master's. She kind of helped figure out some key things with this weed here. So it's a summer annual, one of the few problematic annual plants in blueberry production. And I think most folks know what it looks like, but that's just some pictures in case you're not aware of what that plant looks like. It's one of those weeds that once you get an eye for it, you realize there is a lot of cow wheat around, especially in the crop year fields. The big concern with cow wheat is it is known to be a hemiparasite, which means it has to feed off of a host plant to complete its life cycle, but not necessarily to live. It's been suspected for a long time that it was parasitizing the blueberries, but Vanessa was able to figure that out. And so here you can see cow wheat plants hooked onto the rhizome system of the blueberry plant here. And then in these pictures, the white arrows are pointing to cow wheat roots, and you note that they form this ball or this bulge. And that's a little weird thing called a hostorium, and that's what cow wheat forms so that it can drill into the blueberry rhizomes and start to connect with the vascular tissue and begin to live off of the blueberry plants. Now, this is an image of one of those hostoria off of a related species, field cow wheat, digging into a goldenrod rhizome, which would be beneficial maybe if it did that in blueberry fields. It's probably doing the same thing in blueberries, but we tried to get these images, but trying to cut through the woody rhizome of the blueberries just was very difficult to get a clean cut and to get a good image, because the cutting just kept kind of squishing the wood of the rhizome, and we just couldn't get a clean cut. But we're still trying and hope to have images like this of cow wheat on blueberry plants in the near future. But that's probably what it's doing. And so Cow wheat probably is bad, I guess is the point of these pictures. We don't have any actual experimental data to say that it's actually depleting the blueberries of anything substantial yet. But most growers do say that they notice quite a big yield hit when there's a lot of cow wheat. And that would make sense, given that it is actually parasitizing the blueberry plants. It's an interesting little critter. Vanessa found that up to 30% of the cow wheat seeds that are on the ground at the end of the year actually germinate in December and January and root, but don't form a shoot. And so you can see these cow wheat seeds germinating on the soil surface around the snow here. And Vanessa got these pictures in late December. And so the rest of the seeds will do that in the following spring. Regardless of when the seed germinates, the seedlings don't come up until the following spring. But if you have a bad cow wheat problem, this is kind of the time that you have to hit those plants, but they're almost impossible to find unless you're out of your mind and you're crawling around on your hands and knees in your fields looking for it, like Vanessa did, to get that picture, because they're very, very small. It's one of the few weeds that you guys deal with in which you're actually dealing with a plant coming back from seed on a regular basis. Fescue, sheep sorrel, hawkweed, that stuff, you can see it in the fall. You know where the target is. You know where it is when you're spraying. Cow wheat comes up sporadically from seed across a field, and so you have no idea where it's going to be in a field at any given time because you can't see it until it gets too big too big to be able to kill with a herbicide. Okay, but in the sprout year, the seedlings are all coming up at a time when you can kill them with a myriad of herbicides. And so this is cow wheat seedling emergence in the spring. And if you note here at this particular site, 80% of the seedlings that were going to emerge that year were out of the ground by late May. Okay, they're hard to find. You won't know they're there unless you actually get down and look very closely and try to find them. But this weed emerges starting in late April and continues throughout May and into June. And so these seedlings are emerging at a time where they're an easy target for any number of herbicides. And this is across the rest of the sites that Vanessa did. And everywhere you see the black line, that is the emergence percentage on May 15th. So in mid-May. And so this weed comes up early in the spring, and hence it's easy to hit with any number of herbicides. And one of the biggest challenges with cow wheat is because you don't know where it's going to be. You put out a whole bunch of plots hoping to get a whole bunch of good data, and cow wheat doesn't come up in any of the plots. It comes up around them instead of in the plots, for example. So it's a hard weed to do trials with, and you get a lot of variability like you can see here. But that's the starting density of cow wheat with these different herbicide treatments. The Pyralid, the option was still available at this time, and the Callisto, they were applied on June 3rd. Everything else was applied on May 13th in this trial. And with the exception of Pyralid, just note that everything kills cow wheat. And so even though cow wheat is likely fairly problematic in blueberry fields because of its parasitic nature, it is very sensitive to almost all the herbicides that you have available. And you have the pick of the litter in terms of sprout year control. And if you're able to use Callisto in the crop year, then it will help with cow wheat in the crop year as well. Okay, and there's still a legitimate use for Velpar. I know a lot of folks ask me all the time, what do I use Velpar for anymore? Trust me, Velpar is still a very important herbicide. You'd be in big trouble without it. A lot of blueberry fields would be a hardwood stand without it, for example. And cow wheat still seems to be quite sensitive to it. And so cow wheat is probably one of those indicator weeds where if you have a lot of cow wheat, maybe it's time to give your blueberry field a shot of Velpar again, for example, just to help set that back. Okay. Some of the seeds do germinate in the fall, and so it does seem like there might be some opportunity there for fall management as well. This trial was a fescue trial, not a cow wheat trial, but I just happened to notice this at a few sites that anywhere we had applied fall Chiquera, there was very little cow wheat. And note that there's a whole bunch of cow wheat out here and a whole bunch coming up in the Ignite plot right beside it. And so there probably is opportunity to deal with cow wheat a little bit in the fall as well. And many growers have indicated to me that they're quite certain curb gets it as well, which would make sense. And then lastly, all I want to mention with goldenrod is that I finally got the student that was helping me with the degree day models finally defended in the fall, and we got that stuff published. And so there are degree day models now for predicting goldenrod emergence and development to the flower bud stage and to the flowering stage. And it's great to see where that has finally got to with the presentation that Hugh gave. That's exactly what I always envisioned a growing degree day tool would be. It would tell you what's happened to date, and it would also be forecasting what is likely going to happen in the next few days or so. That's the beauty of that measurement and that tool. And so is to be able to predict the future based on the weather forecast. And so hopefully these will be something that can be added to that. All I want to say about this to finish up is I used to say spray Callisto when goldenrod is 30 centimeters tall. That was never a great recommendation. I always try to put Callisto out if I'm targeting goldenrod between 400 and 500 degree days because that's when most of the new stems are out of the ground. So I don't care about how tall they are anymore. It's just what fraction of them are out of the ground, because you generally, again, with any herbicide that is, because Callisto is not really something you spray at the bud stage to go to the rhizomes. Callisto doesn't work that way. And so with herbicides like that, you try to get them out when you are approaching peak emergence to get your maximum efficacy. And so with goldenrod, that would be somewhere between 400 and 500 growing degree days to do that. So that's what I would recommend in terms of timing Callisto. It's what I try to do in any plot work. And then again, there are models for the bud stage and the flowering stage. Obviously, these are a little less useful for Callisto, but they're very useful for timing weed wiping or spot spraying or something like that. Because I have done some work with glyphosate on goldenrod over the years. And if you just note here in this trial, note that if you don't spray versus spot spray at the pre-bud 30 centimeter stage, flower bud at the flowering stage or at the post-seed stage, note how the regrowth on the goldenrod gets progressively less the following year. As you spray a bit later and a bit later, when those stems are sending sugars down to the rhizome, the glyphosate goes with it, and hence you get better long-term control. And so the idea behind these models would be that if you are doing weed wiping, you would use these models as a basis for timing that so that you're weed wiping when the most amount of plants are at the bud stage and also starting to move into the flowering stage. So again, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 degree days. Right? I think that's enough. So thank you everyone who helps every year with all this stuff. And obviously, thank you very much to the association for all the support. And I'm open to any weed related questions. Weeds, not dope. Ingenia or Roundup. It's the only things that kill it dead. So I didn't see where the question came from. So just get at it with a wiper. We can drop, or I guess the association could drop thousands of dollars on trials, or you can just get down to some grunt work with the products we have and be done with it. It's kind of, that's where it's at. Not saying nothing will come along, but the challenge with dog bane is it's not up and treatable until the blueberries are up as well. which means to do a boom spray, you need a product that will absorb into the dog bane, translocate to the roots, and kill that broadleaf weed without killing the blueberry plants. And that's a tough find. It's not impossible, but it would take a lot of trial work to do. And in the meantime, by the time you get a solution, your field will be a forest of dog bane. Where if you just start this year, it's just one of the ones where it just needs to be the old fashioned, get the wiper out, in my opinion, and just be done with it. Yeah. I know nobody wants that answer, but it works. I mean, I know dog bane's a little hard to wipe, but there's a lot of different weed wiper designs. Okay, we're pretty tunnel vision on a sponge wiper, but globally, there's a ton of different designs, many of which might be better for dog bane than some of the ones that we use. Okay, so that would be my advice there. If you have enough of it, it might warrant investment in a high quality weed wiper. Not saying you don't already have one, but that would be my advice. Yeah. Thank you.